Why was the greatest act of mercy in history treated as the gravest of crimes? We are taught to believe there is no gift more precious than a life saved. But there was a man who went further. He learned to snatch prey from the jaws of death itself. And for this, he was annihilated by a bolt of lightning cast from a cloudless sky. To understand how virtue became sacrilege and hope a cause for divine wrath, we must return to a story that began not with a miracle of salvation, but with a tragedy, a tale of jealousy, blood, and a child born from a funeral pyre. Since time immemorial, the greatest fear of mortals has been death, inevitable, cold, and final, and their greatest dream, to conquer it. Then, in a world where the gods gazed down from Olympus upon human suffering with bored indifference, one appeared who nearly made this dream a reality. His name was Asclepius. He was not merely a physician. He was a miracle incarnate. His hands could knit shattered bones, his herbs could banish any ailment, and his words could restore the will to live in a fading consciousness. But he went further. He learned to do what was inconceivable, what violated the most ancient and unshakable law of the cosmos. He learned to bring the dead back from the realm of Hades, and for this, he was slain, not by the poisoned blade of an envious king, nor the venom of a vanquished foe. His life was ended by a bolt of lightning, cast from a clear sky by the hand of Zeus himself, the ruler of gods and men. A blinding flash, like an angry slash of fate, incinerated the greatest healer in history, turning him to ash before the very eyes of those he had just saved. Herein lies the enigma woven into the fabric of myth, a question that echoes through millennia. Why was a gift that could save humanity from its greatest fear treated as the gravest of crimes? To understand how virtue became sacrilege, and mercy a reason for divine punishment, we must return to the very beginning, to a story that began not with hope, but with tragedy, with love, jealousy, and blood. The story of Asclepius is that of a god's son, born of ash and sorrow. His father was none other than Apollo, the radiant god of light, music, and prophecy, whose beauty was as dazzling as the sunbeams he commanded. One day, while traveling the earth, his golden gaze fell upon a Thessalian princess named She possessed no immortality or divine power, but she had something more captivating than any enchantment: the vibrant, trembling beauty of mortal life. Her laugh rang like a mountain stream, her eyes held the depth of the night sky, and her heart beat in time with the earth itself. Apollo, jaded by the predictable perfection of nymphs and goddesses, fell in love as only an eternal being can with an ephemeral one. Their love ignited like dry kindling, hot, bright, and, alas, doomed. Gods do not know how to love as humans do. Their passion is proprietary, their affection a demand for absolute devotion. After leaving Coronis, who carried his child, Apollo returned to his divine duties in Delphi, but he left his messenger by her side, a raven as white as the first snow, to protect her and report all that happened. But the heart of a mortal woman is a fickle and untamable territory. Loneliness, fear of the future, or perhaps simple human weakness pushed Coronis into the arms of a mortal man, the Arcadian prince. She made the mistake of naively believing her secret could remain hidden from the all-seeing eye of a god. The raven, loyal to its master, flew at once to Delphi. It carried news of betrayal, and with every beat of its wings, the world around it seemed to darken. When the bird delivered the terrible words to Apollo, the divine essence of the god of light revealed its dark, inverse side. His radiance vanished, replaced by an incinerating fury. In his rage, he cursed the messenger of ill tidings, and the raven's snow-white feathers instantly turned black as soot, its melodic voice changing to a hoarse, sorrowful call, an eternal reminder of the pain it had delivered. But a curse was not enough. The god's wounded pride demanded blood. He could not raise his own hand against the one who carried his child. So he turned to his twin sister, Artemis, the ever-youthful goddess of the hunt, whose arrows never missed their mark. Artemis fulfilled her brother's request without question. Her silver arrow pierced Coronis' heart as inevitably as night follows day. And only when Apollo arrived and saw his beloved, lifeless, lying on the ground, did the flame of his anger finally die, leaving behind only the icy horror of realization. He, the god of healing, could not save the one he loved. He himself was the cause of her death. In despair and remorse, he placed her body upon a funeral pyre. As the flames began to lick at her beautiful form, Apollo suddenly remembered his unborn son. In the final moment, reaching his divine hands through the roaring fire, he performed a miracle born of grief. He cut into the flesh of the dead mother and pulled from her a tiny, living infant. The boy, literally snatched from the clutches of death, was named Asclepius. But what was a divine father to do? His hands stained with the blood of his child's mother. He could not raise the son himself, for every glance at the boy would be an eternal reproach. And so Apollo carried the infant to Mount Pythias, to the cave of the wisest and kindest being in all of Greece, the centaur Chiron. Chiron was not like his wild, untamed brethren. He was the son of the Titan Cronus, immortal and filled with knowledge of the secrets of heaven and earth. His powerful equine body spoke of natural strength, but his torso, arms, and face were those of a noble sage with eyes full of compassion. It was he who became father, mother, and teacher to us in Chiron's cave, scented with the aroma of mountain herbs and ancient scrolls. The young demigod mastered the great art of healing, but Chiron taught him more than just mixing potions and applying bandages. He taught him to listen to the whisper of herbs in the wind to understand their power, to listen to the beat of a heart to distinguish the rhythm of life from the arrhythmia of death, to listen to a patient's breath to catch the wheezing of an encroaching shadow. Asclepius absorbed this knowledge with a great thirst, but it was mixed with his own innate heritage. From his divine father, he inherited an intuition, an almost supernatural sense that allowed him to see illness through and through, and from his mother's tragic fate, he received a priceless gift, boundless compassion. He looked upon the suffering not as subjects to be studied, but as living souls trapped in a cage of pain. This empathy, multiplied by his divine gift and the centaur's wisdom, became the force that would one day allow him not just to heal, but to challenge death itself. He did not yet know that his greatest talent would become his curse, and that the path of mercy would lead him straight into the path of Zeus's lightning. The years spent at the foot of Mount Pelion transformed the boy into a man, and the student into a master. Leaving his mentor's cave, Asclepius began his journey through the towns and villages of Greece, and his fame flew before him like a flock of white doves, carrying whispers of miracles on their wings. Kings and slaves, warriors with unhealing wounds, and mothers with fading children in their arms, all which he founded under the shade of cypress trees. He didn't just heal, he restored the very essence of life. He set bones so that they grew back stronger than before. He mixed herbs that banished fever and plague, and he sutured wounds without leaving a scar. People looked at him and saw not just a mortal, however gifted. In his eyes, they saw the compassion of his divine father. In his hands, the tenderness of his slain mother. He was the living embodiment of hope, the last refuge for those whom even the temple priests had abandoned. He stood on the very border, on the thin line between the last breath and eternal silence, and time and again, he pulled souls back from the edge of the abyss. But he had not yet crossed it. The turning point that split his destiny in two came on a quiet, sweltering afternoon. A youth was brought to his sanctuary, the son of a noble Athenian archon, bitten by a snake in the forest. The venom had already spread through his veins, turning his skin a deathly blue. His body thrashed in convulsions, and only hoarse gurgling sounds escaped his throat. Asclepius did everything in his power. He cauterized the wound, poured his strongest antidotes down the youth's throat, and whispered words meant to fortify the spirit and steady the heart. But the venom was stronger. Before his eyes, the young man's body arched one last time and then went limp. His breathing stopped. His eyes glazed over. The silence that fell upon the room was deafening. Asclepius had failed. He, the great healer, had been helpless. Grief and powerlessness burned inside him, hotter than any poison. He sent everyone out of the room, remaining alone with the body in his failure. Sitting by the cold bed, lost in dark thoughts, he suddenly noticed movement. From beneath the stone altar where he mixed his herbs, a snake slithered out, the very same kind that had likely killed the youth. In a fit of blind rage and grief, Asclepius seized his staff and, with one sharp blow, killed the viper, breaking its back. He tossed the lifeless body into a corner and covered his face with his hands again. But not a minute passed before he heard a soft rustling. A second snake, an exact copy of the first, appeared from the same crack. In its mouth, it held a tiny, unique flower with petals, the color of dried blood. It crawled to its dead companion and gently touched its head with the flower. And then the incredible happened. The lifeless body twitched, its scales gleamed faintly, and the dead snake, taking a shuddering breath, came back to life as if nothing had happened. The two snakes intertwined for a moment and then disappeared as quickly as they had come into the crack beneath the altar, leaving the mysterious flower on the stone floor. Asclepius froze. He, the student of Chiron, who had taught him to read the signs of nature, understood this was no accident. This was a gift, or a temptation. With a trembling hand he picked up the plant. His heart hammered in his chest like a trapped bird. He looked at the flower, then at the lifeless body of the youth. Compassion overcame his fear of the unknown. He approached the bed and gently touched the dead man's forehead with the flower. At first, nothing happened, but then a slight tremor ran through the bluish skin. The youth's chest heaved convulsively, and he took a hoarse, ragged breath, as if surfacing from beneath a sheet of ice. Kalu slowly began to return to his face. His eyelids fluttered and then opened. His eyes no longer held the emptiness of death's, they were filled with blue. He was alive. Asclepius, son of Apollo, had snatched his first soul from the tenacious grasp of Hades. He had committed sacrilege. He had performed a miracle. News of this did not spread across Hellas like a whisper, but like a clap of thunder. Now, people brought not only the dying to Asclepius, but also the dead, those whose bodies had not yet been committed to fire or earth, and he refused no one. His art, bolstered by the power of the mysterious plant, reached unimaginable heights. Death, mankind's greatest fear, was no longer a sentence. It became merely a temporary illness that the great physician of Epidaurus could cure. Funeral dirges were replaced by queues at his door. Grief became hope, but the broken law of nature could not remain without consequence. The great scales of the cosmos, with life on one side and death on the other, had tilted dangerously, and the first to feel it were those who dwelt below. For the first time in eons, silence reigned on the banks of the Styx. The grim ferryman Charon sat in his boat, his bony arms crossed over his chest, his empty eye sockets gazing at the still, leaden water. There was no fee for passage, for there were no deceased to ferry. The three-headed Cerberus was bored at the gates, with no one to greet with his fearsome bark. The judges Minos Rhadamanthus and Iacchus sat, idle in their empty hall. But it was worse for the lord of the underworld, Hades, the grim and solitary god whose only joy was order and the unfailing replenishment of his domain, felt his world growing empty. The souls that rightfully belonged to him, that had already completed their earthly journey, were being stolen, snatched back into the world of the living by an arrogant mortal healer. A rage as cold and dark as the waters of Lethe boiled in his eternal soul. He left his throne of black basalt and, shrouded in clouds of darkness, ascended to Olympus to stand before his younger brother and demand justice. Atop the world, in a shining hall, sat Zeus, the thunderer. He listened to Hades' furious speech about his emptying kingdom and the broken law, but Hades' anger was merely the pretext. Zeus saw deeper. He saw not just the theft of souls, but a threat to the entire cosmic order. If mortals ceased to die, what would become of the fate spun by the mortal? Their threads of life, which they so carefully measured for each person, could now be tied back together. If there was no fear of death, what would restrain men from madness? What would make them cherish the fleeting moment allotted to them? And most importantly, how then would the gods differ from men? Immortality was their chief privilege, the foundation of their power. Asclepius, son of a god and a mortal, was erasing that line with his gift. He was giving humans what belonged only to the denizens of heaven. He was, in essence, creating a new race of immortals on earth, rendering the Olympians obsolete. This was not merely a violation, it was a rebellion. A quiet, merciful, but all the more dangerous rebellion against the very nature of things. Zeus's gaze grew as hard as granite. He looked down upon the earth and saw crowds of people worshipping Asclepius, as if he were a new god. A god who was closer, more understandable, and, most terrifyingly, more useful than they were. The decision was made. Order had to be restored, at any cost. In the right hand of the Lord of Olympus, a blinding orb of pure energy began to form, and the skies over Epidaurus, until now clear and cloudless, began to darken, gathering all the wrath of the supreme god. He stared down at the limp form on the bed, his heart pounding like a trapped bird in his chest. The flower, crushed in his clenched fist, had begun to turn black. Asclepius wanted to throw it away, but something held him back. Was it fear of the dead youth's family finding out what he had done? Or was it the dawning realization of what he had unleashed? He looked again at the youth, barely more than a boy really, and thought of his own son, still so full of mischief and life. The boy's parents were standing by the bed, their faces ashen, their eyes dull with grief. Asclepius knew their story. They had come to him after visiting every temple in Greece, after spending every last coin, when all other healers had sent the boy away as incurable. He had taken the desperate parent out of pity and treated the boy, not expecting him to live. Now the boy was alive, and while Asclepius was racked with doubt, the parents were overcome with gratitude. They fell to their knees and begged the god of medicine to forgive them for doubting his powers. He had saved their son. He had defeated Hades himself, and it seemed that even the gods were on his side. But it wasn't the gods. It was the plant. It was its power that had forced the river god's kiss to recede, had snatched the boy back from the clutches of death. And Asclepius had used its power because he didn't want the boy to die. Not because he was arrogant enough to think he could beat Hades, not because he despised the laws of nature, but because his compassion got the better of him. So he broke the law, defied the gods, and unleashed hell on earth. The father of Apollo, son of Zeus himself, heard these tales and came to his son's rescue. He explained that Hades, god of the underworld, was not pleased, that if he did not stop, there might be a terrible retribution. Even so, Asclepius continued, bolstering his power with more and more of the mysterious plant. Soon news of his miraculous cures spread throughout Hellas, drawing crowds of believers to the healing sanctuary of Epi, and among them were many princes and rulers, eager to benefit from the power of the plant. One day, however, the plant was not enough. It couldn't save a young woman who stood before him, barely clinging to life. Her eyes were already glazed over, stared vacantly into space. No pulse quickened under his fingers. Asclepius felt the familiar surge of despair, the same he had experienced when he lost his own mother. And this time, he wouldn't be able to revive her. And he realized then that in his efforts to defy death, he had gone too far. With his hands shaking, he laid the plant down and turned to the crowd. "I am no god," he announced, his voice echoing with newfound understanding. "I am merely a servant of the gods and a mortal like the rest. I cannot defeat death. It is a force beyond my power. These words were like a bucket of water on a blazing crowd. The masseuse, up until now boisterous and noisy, fell silent, stunned by the sudden change in tone. Some muttered amongst themselves. Others gaped at the healer, unable to comprehend his words. And in that moment, Asclepius understood that it wasn't enough to simply tell people that death was inevitable. He had to show them. Taking the dead woman's hand in his, he closed his eyes, focused on the cold, lifeless flesh, and let the despair flow through him. It was a despair born of love, of the deepest sorrow at the passing of life, of the knowledge that everything mortal is transient. And as he surrendered to it, something stirred within him, a new kind of power. It was the power of acceptance, of understanding, and of peace. The goddess of the earth, Gaia, noticed what was happening in the sanctuaries of Epidaurus and smiled. Finally, one of her children understood what she had taught him so long ago. It was not power over life and death that she had given him, but the ability to understand and accept them, to heal, to help, and to console. She had not created a rebel, but a teacher, and she resolved to protect him. When Zeus, wroth with the disobedient healer, hurled his thunderbolt towards him, Gaia rose to meet it. Father and son stood on opposite sides of the mortal coil, both angry, both determined, yet there was respect between them. After all, Apollo, though flawed, was still a god, and Zeus, even in his fury, had to acknowledge the courage and purity of purpose of this mortal. When Hades heard of the confrontation, he smiled for the first time in millennia. He was not a vengeful god, nor did he wish to rule over a realm devoid of souls. He wanted to be feared, respected, and above all, needed. If Asclepius was teaching mortals to accept death, then perhaps it was time to rethink his role in the grand scheme of things. Perhaps instead of condemning the arrogance of healers, he should take Asclepius' place among the gods and learn to listen to the whispers of the living. But Apollo, though beloved by all the Olympians, could not escape the terrible fate that awaited him. This is part 2 of the story. If you haven't watched part 1, I highly recommend you do so now so that you can enjoy this story to its fullest. Also, sorry about the audio issues in part 1. I am still quite new at this. Anyway, let's get started. Asclepius looked up at the gathering storm, his expression serene. Fear did not distort his features, nor did pleading. Only a profound sadness hung on his lips, a premonition of what was to come. The crowd parted instinctively, making a space around him. Even the midday sun beat down less fiercely, as if giving way to the gathering darkness. The air crackled with ozone, and the cypresses whispered among themselves, their voices trembling. Suddenly, a great hush fell upon the earth, not with a thunderclap, but with a deafening, dead silence that precedes a strike. The voices ceased, the rustle of the cypresses fell still, and even the cicadas in the grass went quiet, as if sensing a will hanging over the world, far more ancient and terrible than their instincts. The crowd, a moment ago filled with reverence, raised their heads to the sky. The sun had vanished, swallowed by an unnatural, inky cloud that had condensed from nothing. The air grew thick, heavy smelling of ozone and the cold of the void. Asclepius looked up as well. There was no fear or surprise in his eyes, only an infinite, profound sadness. He understood. He, the son of a god, had always known he was walking a blade's edge, and now that edge had turned upward. He lowered his gaze to the people, to their frightened, uncomprehending faces, and in his final gesture there was neither despair nor pleading. He only smiled softly, as if asking forgiveness for not being able to save them from this. And then the heavens split apart. It was not lightning, but a pillar of pure white fire, a spear of divine justice launched from Olympus with flawless precision. It made no sound of thunder, only a piercing, high-pitched shriek of the torn fabric of the cosmos. For one blinding instant, the world vanished, dissolved in unbearable radiance, and when the light receded, leaving only dancing spots in everyone's eyes. On the spot where the greatest healer had stood, there was nothing, only a circle of scorched black earth and a handful of grey ash, which a sudden gust of wind immediately caught and scattered. At that same moment in distant Delphi, in the heart of his sanctuary, Apollo cried out. It was not a scream, but a silent shriek that no mortal ear heard, yet it shook the stones of the temple and, for a moment, dimmed the sunlight across the world. The strings of his golden lyre, hanging on the wall, snapped one by one with a dry, mournful crack. He felt his son's death not as news but as a physical blow, as if his own divine essence had been pierced by an icy spear. He had seen everything, his child's mercy, his greatest deed, and the blind fury of Zeus. Grief, as deep and bitter as on the day he stood over Coronis' funeral pyre, overwhelmed him. But now it was mixed with something new, something immortals rarely experience, helpless rage. He could not unleash his anger on Zeus himself, but divine wrath, once born, demands an outlet. It must find a target, and Apollo found one. Not the murderer, but the murder weapon. His radiant form darkened, becoming like a thundercloud, and he vanished from Delphi, leaving behind only a ringing silence and a chill. He went not to Olympus, but into the bowels of the earth, to the heart of the volcano Etna, where, amid eternal din and heat, labored those who had forged the fatal lightning bolt. The Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants, the brilliant smiths of the gods, Zeus's favorites. They were a force of nature, as ancient as the mountains themselves. Apollo burst into their subterranean forge not as the shining god of the arts, but as a vengeful spirit. His golden arrows, which usually brought only a swift and painless death to the chosen, were now steeped in the venom of his grief. He spoke not a word. One by one, silver threads flew from his bowstring, and each found its marker a single enormous eye in the center of her forehead. The giants, who could withstand the heat of a star and the blows of titans, fell to the stone floor of their forge, not understanding who was punishing them or why. The cry that tore from Apollo's chest was not a cry of sorrow, but of a monstrous, universal injustice. He had taken his revenge. He had killed the creators of the lightning bolts. He had defied the Thunderer himself. What do you think will happen next? Will Zeus punish Apollo for killing the Cyclopes? Let me know in the comments. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.